So thank you all for coming out today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I think we are really excited to hear about your work and how you're addressing racial disparities in criminal justice. We know that since the passing of the Civil Rights Act, Americans have been grappling with the ongoing societal damage of slavery, Jim Crow, as well as disinvestment in communities of color and the institutionalization of racial disparities. But I'm super excited to have you all here to highlight the work that you're doing in uncovering and addressing and clearly understanding the complexity of these issues. So Christine, tell me a little bit about your work.
Sure. So I work for District Attorney George Gascon in the San Francisco DA's office, and we have been engaged in quite a bit of work in the last several years around racial disparities. I have to tell you that unfortunately, unlike most cities in the country, when we look at our data, we see that we are much more likely to arrest and prosecute African Americans and Latinos than we are other groups of people. And when we look at that disproportionality, now we're trying to ask ourselves, is that also disparate? Are we treating people differently based solely on race, or are we treating them differently because they're engaged in different types of activity? And that has led us to contact researchers at UC Berkeley and University of Pennsylvania, and we're asking them to look at all of the decision points for a prosecutor from charging, detention, all the way through, I think I have a chart here, all the way through conviction. And if you can look at this, is for African Americans. This was done by the Hayward Burns Institute last year, and it shows us that the disparity increases through the process, not decreases. And so this to us is obviously of great concern, as we are one of the downstream users of police reports. What are we doing with that information? And it appears to us from some initial work that's been done that we may be exacerbating those disparities. And so we're hopeful that by the end of this year, we will have some very concrete responses to who we're charging with what crimes. Are we charging them at the same rates for the same conduct, and what types of sentences and convictions are we seeking for those individuals? We also know that we've had a lot of challenges in a prosecutor's office. Our work all relies on the work of the police department, and in San Francisco, we've had some real challenges within our police force in the last couple of years that if you're local, you may have read about. And we've recently had both a blue ribbon panel that was commissioned by the district attorney, as well as the U.S. Department of Justice COPS office come in to look at the police department, and they have identified that, one, African Americans are stopped more frequently for traffic stops than their white counterparts, and greater than their percentage in the population, which you could explain through a variety of things, but when we look more deeply at that, what we see is then they're also more likely to be subjected to a non-consensual search at a rate of 42%, which again, you could say there were some indicators of crime or other things, but then what we see at the very bottom here is, but with the lowest hit rate. So police officers stop those individuals, believe they're engaged in criminal activity, but when they search them, don't end up finding evidence of criminal activity. And that tells us that something is happening in the way we're enforcing our laws that is disparate. And those are the questions we're trying to get to the bottom of. We have, as a result of some racist text messages that were sent by some San Francisco police officers, we developed a partnership with Codex at Stanford, and we're now looking at the entire body of work of these 14 police officers that made explicitly extremely racist statements, to see if we can learn from the way they did their work as police officers compared against a control group of other police officers. Do we see something different about how those officers do their work? And can we learn from it so that we don't exacerbate the bias that those officers possessed as the cases come to us and move through the criminal justice system? So we're looking at over 4,000 police reports, all paper reports. So Codex has helped us to now machine read those and put them into 81 different fields of information. And we're going to analyze those against a control group and see what we can learn about the way we are policing and prosecuting people in San Francisco. And I will stop there so that others can speak, but I have more to say.
So Christiane, can you let us know kind of, as a lead statistician at HRDAG, kind of where you come in, what have you uncovered, and how are we really understanding this issue as a whole?
Yeah, so first, thanks for having me. One of the things I spend a lot of my time thinking about is how applying machine learning to criminal justice data can reinforce and in some cases amplify the biases that already exist in the system that you're just talking about. And I think this is easiest to demonstrate with an example. So there are some slides up on either sides here. The lower left map, in the upper left, excuse me, I'm showing the location of drug crime reports in the city of Oakland in 2010. The brighter the shade of red, the more drug crimes are recorded in that location. So this comes directly from Oakland PD's database of drug reports. You'll see that drug crimes are predominantly recorded in two locations. Up in west-ish Oakland, that's the circle. So we're again looking at the upper left-hand figure. And roughly along International Boulevard, which is the thin black line right there. We should compare this to the map on the lower left, which shows the racial demographics of Oakland. I didn't make that map, I got it off the internet, and I should have a citation for that. But on this map, each African American resident is shown with a green dot, Hispanics are shown with orange, Asians with red, and white people are shown by blue dots. So each individual resident is shown on this map. And the locations where the police had the large number of records are shown similarly, so the circle and the line also are in roughly the same locations on the lower map as they are in the upper map. And what we can see from this is that the locations where the police found a lot of drug crime occurred predominantly in African American and Hispanic communities, so the green dots within the circle and the sort of like orangish and maybe a little bit of reddish area along that line. All right, so now there's lots of evidence actually that people of all races use illegal drugs at very similar rates. Yet if you look at the locations where the police have recorded drug crimes, you'll find that drug laws are predominantly enforced in those two locations, so again, in communities of color. If there were not biased enforcement of drug laws, what we'd expect to see would be that the drug crimes would be found all over the place. So that would look like in the upper left-hand and the upper left-hand figure, we'd see a similar shade of red everywhere. It might not be so bright, but it'd be pretty similar everywhere. And the records in the police records wouldn't be so concentrated in those few areas. So this is what over-policing looks like. This is what disparate policing looks like. Some neighborhoods and communities are disproportionately impacted by the enforcement of the law. And this isn't to say this isn't meant to be an indictment of the Oakland police. I truly do believe that most police officers are doing their best to enforce the law in a very fair way, but this is how it has shaken out in this case. So in statistics, what we see here, or here, I guess, is this is what we call a biased sample. Drug crimes that occur in some locations, so in this case, locations that are predominantly inhabited by people of color, are more likely to appear in the data set than crimes that occur in the whiter parts of town, so the blue area up above, right, the hills of Oakland. So although it's likely that drug crime is happening everywhere in Oakland, the crimes that occur in certain parts of town are recorded at a much higher rate than those that occur elsewhere. There's a common misconception that applying technology or machine learning to this problem will reduce these sorts of racial disparities in enforcement, and that is simply not true. Machine learning reproduces the patterns that are found in the data that you give to it. The figure on the right, so this is the one that's moving around a lot, it's probably caught your attention already. This shows a looping movie of what would happen if we used the police data from 2010 to make daily predictions about where drug crime would be for each day in 2011. This is actually called predictive policing. The red squares in the little movie there show which locations we'd predict would have the most drug crime on each day. And these are the locations where additional police officers would be sent if we were using this in a predictive policing context, like many police departments throughout the United States are doing right now. So you can see that rather than directing officers to other locations, resulting in more fair policing of drug crimes, the algorithm simply directs policing right back to the already over-policed communities, right back to that circle and right along that line. So those red squares hover over the two locations that I'd already identified as likely being over-policed with respect to drug crimes. And machine learning, again, is just directing even more police attention right back to those locations. So this is what I mean when I say that technology has the potential to reinforce the biases that already exist in the data. The data was biased in the first place, and machine learning did not correct the bias. Rather, it likely made it worse by sending more officers to those same locations that were already over-policed. Over-policing is a really serious problem, and in this case, machine learning likely would have made that problem worse. So I'll close quickly now by addressing this to the coders out there in the audience, that I think you all have the potential to do some really great and really important work, but you also have the potential to cause some serious harm. And I'd urge you to think very carefully about the biases that exist in the data sets that you're using, and to think very carefully about whether the tools you create with those data sets will reinforce the biases that already exist. Thanks.
Wayne, you've been in this for a long time, first as director of prosecution and the Racial Disparities Program at Vera Institute, and now you're at the NY Probation Department as general counsel. What is your breadth of work? How have you, in both spaces, worked to address this?
Well, I first became a prosecutor because I was acutely aware of two things. Number one, the historical and the continuing racial bias against black and brown people in the criminal justice system, but also the almost universal whiteness of all of the other actors in the system, in particular the prosecutor's office. And so after becoming a veteran prosecutor, I was a deputy chief in the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office and also the president of the National Black Prosecutors Association when the Vera Institute came knocking on my door. And they wanted me to review a concept paper. And this paper was about using data to help prosecutors identify racially biased decision-making in their offices. Now, I knew as a deputy chief, I made hundreds of decisions that impacted people's lives on a daily basis. And to say that you could use data to sort of count and measure decision-making processes in a prosecutor's office seemed like a huge challenge to me and a huge opportunity. And so it left me with actually those three questions. Number one, how could we possibly do this? Number two, in the concept paper, they had identified 3 prosecutor offices that were willing to be part of this pilot. And so that led me to ask, well, how did they possibly recruit 3 white, middle-aged chief prosecutors to even take the risk of addressing the 4-letter word in the criminal justice system, race? And in fact, one prosecutor said it was like voluntarily inviting the termites into your home. And the third question was, well, what the heck did the acronym VERA really stand for? And so I'm happy to say that I got answers to all 3 of those questions. The first, I was actually part of helping to create a data process for evaluating decision-making in prosecutor offices, basically by looking at the disparate outcomes at some of the major decision points in the prosecution process. So just as an example, one of the first things that prosecutors do when they get a case is decide whether or not they're even going to accept the case for prosecution. And so in one jurisdiction, we looked at their decision-making to not accept cases for prosecution. And when we looked at it on the racial lines, about 30% of the time, whether you were black or white, your case was not accepted for prosecution. And so that gave them the opinion, well, we're doing a really good job. But then we started looking at the decisions when the case was a felony and when it was a misdemeanor. And quite frankly, there was no disparities there either in their decision-making processes. But then we dug further and we examined the 7 major crime categories of cases that they prosecute. 5 out of the 7 categories, if you were black, you stood a better chance of having your case accepted for prosecution. In one area, if you were white, you actually stood a better chance of being prosecuted. And the 7th area, the numbers were so small that it really didn't matter. Well, all of a sudden, when we looked at those categories, you started to see a pattern starting to emerge. And when we examined drug crimes, we found this huge disparity. If you were white, you stood a 67% chance of having your case not prosecuted. Of course, the leftover percentage was the example if you were black. You had, let's say, maybe a 3 times greater chance of being prosecuted. So using data, we actually identified the 2 specific drug crimes that was driving this disparity rate. One was the first-time possession of cocaine, The second was the possession of drug paraphernalia. And we were even able to identify the unit that was driving this disparity. And when we showed it to the managers and the district attorney, the first thing was, why are we prosecuting these cases when clearly this is more evidence of drug addiction? Why are we wasting our resources? The second question was, yeah, and who's making these decisions? Well, it was the youngest prosecutors in the office. And looking at this data, they were able to institute changes that completely reverse that direction. First of all, there was a default diversion to drug treatment. If you wanted to prosecute it, you had to get approval. And he also mixed senior prosecutors in with the younger prosecutors. So that's just direct evidence that you actually can use data to help inform not just the decision-making process, but to actually address racially disparate decision-making in prosecutors' offices. There are clearly some big challenges, the biggest challenge being prosecutor offices just don't have the type of data systems that we need to actually get this job done.
So we heard how data plays and a huge warning for coders when we're talking about like building in machine bias and machine learning. What are other ways that the civic technology community can get involved and address this issue together?
I think what Wayne said is so accurate. We're offices full of lawyers. We're not offices full of coders and programmers and analysts, and we just don't have the human power to do more than ask the right question. And we really need these types of partnerships with people in tech that can help us answer questions like, are we being disparate? Who should we be releasing from jail and based on what? What are we doing for juvenile offenders so they don't come into the adult system? Are we giving different sentences for different people for the same crime? Those are all questions we've asked ourselves, but we can't answer on our own because our data sits in pieces of paper or in clunky case management systems where we can't extract it.
Okay. Well, I definitely want to thank, it seems like we're all out of time on this really, really juicy topic, but I want to thank each one of you. And then I just want to encourage you all to have a seat at this table. We only can move together collectively. So I definitely have a call to action for all of you to get involved in addressing racial disparities in our criminal justice system. Thank you.
Thank you.